Hello, welcome to our first year 8 lesson on development of democracy. The first thing you do is your low stakes quiz. This is just your short quiz on what you learned in your last lesson. When I tell you to, you're going to pause the video, click the link in the video description to bring up your quiz, complete your quiz, and then submit and check your answers. So if you can pause your video now. Okay, now the question we're going to be looking at for the next few lessons is what stories can we tell about the development of democracy in Britain? First of all, we need to think about what does the word democracy mean? The word democracy is a type of government, so the way a country or a place is run, where it's based on what the people in that country want. So the people have a say in how their country is run. And our title for today is How Democratic Was Britain Before 1750? So that means how much was Britain a democracy before 1750? Remember, a democracy is a government based on the will of the people, so giving the people a say in how the country is run. And today we're going to tell the story of the changes in who held political power before 1750 and evaluate the extent to which Britain was a democracy before 1750. So if you can pause your video now to write your title and also the keyword democracy. Okay, welcome back. So now in medieval England, lots of us learnt about it last year. In medieval England, the king, the monarch, held pretty much all of the power. They could decide most things. That's very different to today, where Parliament decides what happens in Britain. Parliament, led by the Prime Minister, decide what happens in Britain, and the people in Parliament are all voted for by adults over the age of 18. So every 4 years, adults over the age of 18 vote for which political party they want to run the country. So this is very different to what it was like in the medieval period, where we had one person ruling the country and deciding what happened. Now, and the only reason they have that job is because they were born into that job. Whereas now we have hundreds of MPs who represent the views of the different people in England, and they run the country on behalf of the people, based on what the people want. Now, in your books, I would like you to make a timeline. Okay, so just like this one I have here, we're just going to draw a line. We're going to write these dates: 1215, 1629, 1649, 1660, and 1689. So if you can pause your video and just copy this timeline. Okay, great, welcome back. Now, in this first section, we're going to be using a few words which might be new. You might have heard them before. The first one is Magna Carta, and this is just a document signed by King John and the barons that limited the power of the king. Parliament. This is a meeting of elected MPs, that means MPs who have been voted for, to debate and pass new laws and taxes. Consent, that just means agreement. If you've got someone's agreement or consent to do something. And a burgess is a wealthy businessman who is elected to medieval parliaments. You don't need to worry about copying these down, but you can always rewind to look at them again if you can't remember what they mean. Okay, so what were things like before 1215, before the Magna Carta was signed? Well, early medieval kings enjoyed immense power. They, and only they, could change laws, go to war, and introduce new taxes. So if a king, for example, King Henry I, if he wanted to change a law, he could change it like that. If he wanted to go to war, he could just do it. If he wanted to introduce new taxes that everybody had to pay, he could. He didn't have to listen to anybody. So this system, if we think about it, was really not very democratic, because the only person who had any say in how the country was run was the king. Nobody else had any say. So it was incredibly undemocratic. Now, this changed in 1215. King John, he got himself into a bit of a pickle, and the barons, who were important people in England, forced King John to sign something called the Magna Carta. And all this did was it placed limits on the power of the king, so it reduced his power. And following on from the Magna Carta, the barons decided to set up Parliament. So it hadn't existed before. And this was a meeting of important noblemen, like barons, to advise the king and present petitions. So like a list of signatures saying, King John, we suggest that you do this. 80 of us think it's a good idea. And it also said that the king needed Parliament's consent to raise taxes. So if a king, once Parliament was set up, if the king wanted to raise taxes, if he wanted to make everyone pay him a bit of money, he had to go to Parliament and say, dear Parliament, I would like to increase taxes. I would like to raise a new tax. And Parliament could say yes, and then the king could go and do it, but they could say no. And so the king, they might say to the king, no, unless you do something else for us. So Parliament began to have power, mainly because they could refuse to raise taxes for the king. Now, this system, if we think about before, only the king had any say in how the country was run. This system is a little bit more democratic. It's not just the king, it's the king and the other noblemen, like the barons. And to be a nobleman, you have to be incredibly important and you have to be incredibly rich. So it's not most of the people, it's not even half of the people, it's a tiny, tiny percentage, 1 or 2% of people who had a say in how the country was run. So it's not very democratic, but it is a little bit more democratic than the system underneath when it was just the king with all the power. And this system carried on developing in the Middle Ages, and it gave a bit more power to a few more people. So by the 14th century, Parliament also included a House of Commons. So it split into a House of Lords, like the barons, and the House of Commons. And this was people like knights and burgesses. And burgesses were elected, but only a small number of incredibly rich people who lived in towns were burgesses or had a vote. And knights were kind of noble, but slightly less important. So we're still on no more than 3% of the population who had any say in Parliament. Now, what we're going to do is some true or false questions. Now, in your book, I just want you to write 1 true, 2 false, for example. Or you can just write T or F. You don't need to write out the whole question. Question 1. Before 1200, Parliament had more power than the monarch. Take some time to think. This is false. Before 1200, actually, it was the monarch who had more power. Question 2. Medieval monarchs could change the laws, go to war, and introduce taxes without listening to anyone else. Have a think. Write down your T or your F. True. Well done. Okay. Medieval monarchs had huge amounts of power. They could do all of these things without listening to anyone else. Question 3. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215, put limits on the monarch's power. Let's have a think. Is this true or is this false? It's true. After Magna Carta, the barons set up Parliament. Is this true or is this false? Have a think. It's also true. Well done. Question 5. Parliament was a meeting of normal people like farmers to advise the king and present petitions. Let's have a think. Is this correct? True or false? Write down your answer. This one is false. It was a meeting of important people like barons to advise the king. Question 6. The king could raise taxes whenever he wanted. So we're after the Magna Carta now. So a little think. True or false? False. The king needed the agreement or the consent of Parliament to raise taxes. So Parliament could say yes or they could say no. And question 7. By the 14th century, only the richest people had any say in Parliament. Is this true or is this false? Have a think. Write down your answer. It is true. Well done if you got all of those correct. And the next thing we are going to do is we're just going to fill in a little bit of your timeline. Okay, so we've got a timeline here in front of us. Now above the timeline where it says 1215, we're going to write. Let's just summarize what we thought about. So the barons and King John signed the Magna Carta. Now, underneath the timeline in this bit, we're going to put how this affected who had the power and how democratic England was. So this limited the king's power. So, and that made England a tiny bit more democratic. Okay. Great. Pause the video to make sure you can write that down. Okay, welcome back. So, in this section, the keywords we're going to be using are absolute monarchy. This was ruled by a king or queen without parliament. Divine right. This is the idea that the monarch's power, the king or queen's power, came directly from God. They were given their job by God. They were basically had some of the power of God on earth. Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell was a man. He was an MP who led Parliament in the Civil War, and he became something called the Lord Protector. The franchise, and this is just the franchise is whoever has the ability or the right to vote. The Levellers, they were a radical group of people who wanted to extend the franchise to more people. So they wanted to give more people the right to vote. And the Restoration, and this is the return of the monarchy under Charles II. So, Charles I. Now, Charles I, he believed in the divine right of kings. So Charles I's father wrote this in 1622. He wrote, "Kings are accountable to God only. So it is a crime for anyone to argue about what a king can do." Now, if we think about this, this is basically saying Parliament can't say to the king, "We don't want you to do that." Parliament can't say to the king, "We advise you to do this." Or at least that is what James and his son, Charles I, thought. They thought Parliament couldn't ask them any questions. Parliament couldn't say to them, "You can do this or you can't do that," because they thought as kings that their power came directly from God. They had believed they had the divine right, and therefore that meant they could rule as an absolute monarch without paying any attention to Parliament. Now, this idea is very undemocratic because actually it's going back to what England was like before Magna Carta, when the king had absolutely all of the power and paid no attention to anybody. It's very undemocratic. And it's going to cause problems because what Charles I was doing was he was saying to a group of people, Parliament, who used to have some power, he was saying to them, "You don't have that power anymore. You can't do this, you can't do that anymore." So it's going to cause problems because he's taking away power from people who already had it. So they were going to be quite cross. And so for a period of 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, Charles ruled without Parliament. Charles had an argument with Parliament and he refused to call them, he refused to let them come in and sit down and discuss things, etc., for 11 years. And this period of time from 1629 to 1640 is called Charles's personal rule, because he personally ruled the whole of England without paying attention to anybody. Now, Charles thought it was okay to do this because he believed that he had the divine right of kings, that he was given his power by God, and therefore that he could rule as an absolute monarch, so rule completely on his own without help from anybody. So he shut down Parliament because he didn't need help from anybody. And this caused so many problems because Parliament were incredibly angry. Many MPs were incredibly angry that they were not allowed to do their job of advising the king, agreeing to taxes, etc. So England kind of went into a civil war where Parliament, led by an MP called Oliver Cromwell, rebelled against the king and they fought him. And they fought him really hard, and eventually in 1649 Charles was captured, defeated and executed. He had his head chopped off here. So he was no longer the king because he was dead. Now, Parliament, Charles I had a son called Charles. Parliament didn't want Charles, the new Charles, his son, to become the King of England. So instead, they made Oliver Cromwell the Lord Protector. And the plan was that Oliver Cromwell, the leader of Parliament, would rule England with Parliament's agreement, with help from Parliament, Torsten, etc. But this is not what happened. Oliver Cromwell became he was called a king in all but name, because he refused to pay any attention to Parliament, and he was basically, in many people's minds, not actually ruling very differently to how Charles I had done in his personal rule. An example of this, the fact that actually Oliver Cromwell was not committed to running a fair country and making it more democratic, was actually that a group of people, the Levellers, approached Oliver Cromwell and said, we think that you should extend the franchise, which means you should let some more people vote. And Oliver Cromwell said, no way, Jose. He was not extending the franchise. So if we think about it, Cromwell's rule was not really any more democratic than Charles I's personal rule. They were both very undemocratic because one person, either Charles I or then later Oliver Cromwell, held pretty much all of the power. Now, Cromwell died, and then in 1660, King Charles I's son, who's also called Charles, returned to England, and he was restored as the monarch. The monarchy was kind of restored, which means like brought back, and he became known as Charles II. And so England went from being a monarchy with a king. 1649, they chopped the head off their king. They were no longer a monarchy. They were a republic, and they had a Lord Protector instead of a king. He wasn't that popular. The Lord Protector died, and they brought back the monarchy. They brought back Charles I's son and made him King of England and called him Charles II. So if we think about it, really, what changed with the Civil War? We had a king got killed. We had someone who acted like a king but wasn't really a king. He went away, and then we got the king back again. Basically, nothing was changed by the Civil War. So we're going to do some true or false questions. Question 1. Absolute monarchy is when Parliament have all the power. Give it a think. Write your answer down. P or F. False. An absolute monarchy is when a monarch rules without Parliament. Divine right is the belief that a monarch's power comes from God. True or false? Give it a think. Write down your answer. It's true. Charles I, for example, believed in the divine right. Charles ruled without Parliament for 50 years. Give it a think. Is this true or false? Write it down. False. Charles did rule without Parliament, but only for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640. Parliament and Charles had a civil war, ending with Charles being executed. Give it a think. Write your answer down. This is true. He was executed in 1649. Question 5. MP Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector, where he ruled by giving Parliament lots and lots of power. True or false? Give it a think. Write down your answer. This is false. Cromwell was called a king in all but name because he ruled without Parliament, just like Charles had. And question 6. In 1660, Parliament invited the son of Charles I, who was also called Charles, to come back to be the monarch, and this is called the Restoration. Give it a think. Write down your answer. This is true, and this Charles, the son, became known as Charles II. Well done if you got all of those correct. We're going to add some things to our timeline. So, 1629 to 1640. This period was Charles I's 11 years without Parliament. We might put in brackets that it was his personal rule because he personally did everything himself, ignoring everybody else. And so if we think about this, what happened to the king's power? Well, actually, the king's power increased and it became less democratic. Then Charles, Parliament got into a civil war, which ended up in 1649 with Charles I being executed. He had his head chopped off by Parliament. Oof. Well, obviously, this led to the king's power vanishing. He had no power because he had no head. Okay, and then we moved on to 1660. What happened in 1660? Well, actually, we have something called the Restoration. And this was when Charles II came back and was made king. And with this, we have that the king's power increased because it went from 0 to some. Okay, great. If you pause your video, make sure you've got all these 3 things written down. Charles I, 11 years of personal rule, Charles being executed, and the Restoration. Okay, great. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at one final section, and for this one, the key word we need is the Bill of Rights. This is a set of laws for the king. He agreed. This is a set of laws for the king to follow, and it was agreed by Parliament and William III in 1689. So, now, the Restoration, Charles II became the king, and then his son, James II, became the king afterwards. This was a bit of a problem. Both Charles II and James II were Catholic. Now, Catholic is a type of Christian. Parliament were not Catholic. They were Christian, but they were Protestant, a different type of Christian. And Catholics and Protestants, since the 1500s, had not really gotten on with each other. And England had, and Parliament in England had pushed for 100 years to make sure that England was a Protestant country. And so Parliament were worried that King Charles II or James II would make England a Catholic country again, which they did not want. What could they do about this? So, when James II died in 1688, Parliament invited the Protestant Dutch ruler, who's called William of Orange, to become the King of England. They wanted him because he was a Protestant, and therefore he would keep the religion of England Protestant. William of Orange heard this and he said, yeah, sure, I'll come over and be your king. So he came over to England, he became the King of England, and he was known as William III. Now, Parliament and William agreed on a Bill of Rights. Obviously, Parliament had learned they saw the problems caused by the personal rule, the problems caused by having a Lord Protector, and so they agreed on a Bill of Rights, and this was like a set of things which William and Parliament both agreed to do. And this was signed in 1689. Now, the Bill of Rights said the king had to obey the law at all times. And remember, it's Parliament who makes laws. So if a law gets made by Parliament, the king has to follow it. He can't just ignore it. The king needed Parliament's consent to raise taxes. So if the king wanted to raise a new tax, he had to ask Parliament and they had to agree to it. Remember, this gave Parliament some power because they could say, we'll only agree to it if you do this. So it gave Parliament quite a lot of leverage. But, and this is when we think about how democratic England was, the ability to vote was still limited to the very rich. So these things are good, and they made England more democratic because the king, and kings aren't democratic, the king had to pay attention to Parliament who had been elected by some of the English people. But it was still not very many, still no more than 3%. Of the English people were able to vote and therefore send someone to Parliament to represent them. So Britain, by 1689, it was more democratic than it had been at the time of Magna Carta, the time of the personal rule, the time of the execution of Charles and the Restoration. So it was much more democratic than it had ever been, but it was still not very democratic because although the king's power was quite clearly limited by Parliament, and Parliament had more power, not very many people actually were allowed to vote. So it was not that democratic. So, true or false? You're going to write just down T or F in your book. Question 1, Charles II and his son James II were both Catholic. Give it a think. Write down your T or your F. This is true. Parliament were happy about the religion of Charles II and James II. Read it back through. Give it a think, write down your answer. False. They were worried that the kings would make England Catholic instead of Protestant, so they were unhappy about the religion of Charles and James. Parliament invited the French leader, William of Yellow, to become the King of England because he was a Protestant. Let's give it a think. Write down our T or our F. This is false. Parliament invited the Dutch leader, William of Orange, to be King of England as he was a Protestant. Parliament and William signed the Bill of Rights. Let's give it a think. Write down our answer. This is true. Question 5. The Bill of Rights said that the king could do what he wanted. Let's give it a think. Write down our answer. This is false. It said that the king had to obey the law at all times and that the king needed Parliament's consent to raise taxes. Question 6. The Bill of Rights extended the franchise, who got to vote, to most English people. Give it a think. Write down your answer. This is false. Voting was still limited to the richest people, about 3% of the population. Now, we are going to fill in the final bit of our timeline, 1689. So 1689 is the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights importantly said that the king has to obey laws and that the king needed Parliament's consent for taxes. So if we think about how democratic this was, the king's power decreased. Whose power increased? Parliament's power which is great, but only the richest could vote. Okay. Pause your video, make sure you've got all of that down. Okay, if you missed out some bits before, just check through. Okay, and then the final thing we need to do today is just your exit ticket. This is just your short quiz to check what you've understood from today's lesson. So when I tell you to, you're going to pause the video, click the link in the video description to bring up your quiz, complete your quiz, and then submit and check your answers. Really well done for your work today. And if you can pause your video now.